I do really want to be able to introduce you to Steve Maillett, who is from the NDIA. And Steve is the manager of the Information Linkages Capacity Building area of the NDIA. I hope I've got that correct. Yes. And the reason that Steve is here, and this is similar to when we had Helen Nyes here this morning from Department of Communities, we asked both the NDIA and the Department of Communities if they could come and tell us what do they see that they will be doing in the future to support peer support and self-advocacy. So that's the task we've given to Steve, and I'm hoping he might be able to tell us a bit more about what the NDIA plan. So please welcome Steve to the stage.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm just going to put this down here. I haven't prepared a presentation as in a PowerPoint slide deck because, one, it's usually much more technically, I'm not very technically savvy, for one, so I'll just call that out first off. The other thing is I do work in Geelong, and I have been working on the ILC for a couple of years now. I haven't just come off the plane from Canada, although even after 13 years in this country, I still very much sound like I've just landed. So apologies for that, but I am married to a Canadian, so I do get a recharge most evenings in Canadian speak. My 7-year-old daughter actually, and I will get to the point of this very quickly, but my 7-year-old daughter said, I overheard her saying to a friend the other day who was visiting, my daddy doesn't speak English like we do. He speaks Canadian. And I just thought that that was a pretty endearing term, something very funny to overhear. Look, the information linkages and capacity building, or ILC, is the probably, from my point of view, and I might be a little bit biased, but I think it's one of the best bits of the scheme. Originally, this was conceptualized as what was then called Tier 2. And in recognition that not all people with disability would be eligible for a funded plan. And so knowing that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.3 to 4.5 million Australians with disability, and perhaps only somewhere around 460,000 who would be eligible for a plan, this whole notion of ILC or Tier 2 was born. And some of you might have been involved in some of the initial consultations that were run. There were some targeted consultations that were run in WA, but as you know, there was a period of time where it was uncertain who would actually be responsible for funding ILC in this jurisdiction. We're now at a point where, with the bilateral that's been signed, we've been engaging with our colleagues with the WA state government around what the transition arrangements will look like for ILC over the coming period. And why I'm a little bit vague on that is we're still at the kind of near the final stages of landing the exact date when the NDIA will become responsible for funding ILC. But for anyone who studies the budget papers, and I know that there's often some budget nerds out there, and myself included, you may have noticed that in the recent mid-year economic fiscal outlook, that there was a budget increase and an allocation that recognized that the bilateral agreement had been signed. And in actual fact, there is some funding that can be available during this transition period that we can talk to the WA state government about how that gets used. It won't become a big surprise to many people in the room that one of the things that we've been looking at investing in ILC is the delivery of supports delivered by people with disability for people with a disability. Now that's one of the key focus areas that was outlined in the ILC commissioning framework that was released back in late 2016. The NDIA board have recently asked us to look at what would an investment strategy or what would the plan for future investment look like, given that we have this likelihood of being able to finally commission ILC nationally come July 2019. And I say likely because that's possibly the date that we're kind of working towards as a logical date when the agency could commence funding ILC. And so we've been doing a little bit of work of late and have put up a strategy to the board around what the future directions of ILC could look like. And I'll give you kind of some idea of what the broad principles are that we're working towards. And one of them is, how do we ensure that there's a local place-based response that's working with people with disability in community? That at the moment, we've been testing through the local area coordination role, where in other parts of the country outside of New South Wales, we have local area coordinators who are funded and charged with delivering 20% of their time and effort on ILC-like activity. In light of the thinking about where the investment strategy is going, it would be remiss of us not to at least look at that and try to understand, is it actually achieving what it is that it set out to do in the first instance? And how might the agency need to resource and support those organizations in achieving those outcomes at a local level? The other kind of major thinking around what the investment strategy would look like at full scheme is recognizing that information is one of the key one of the key big pillars of the ILC policy. And so by information, what I mean here is that national core information infrastructure that regardless of where you live, you would have access to reliable, consistent, and up-to-date information that could be diagnostic specific for particular disability cohorts, or that could provide independent access to high quality information to provide stronger linkages into community. The other sort of core feature of the future investment strategy is a recognition that, and we know this from some of the grant rounds that we've run to date, that it shouldn't be about organizations that have sophisticated grant writing capability being the most successful at delivering ILC activities. So, by thinking about this, how do we ensure that there's a real focus on organizations that are both led by people with disability and who employ people with disability? And so by that I mean user-led organizations really being quite a strong feature in our future investment mix. Now there's obviously quite a bit of work to do in really unpacking what is the definition of a user-led organization, and importantly, where they don't exist, how do we start to signal and steward the market towards responding in a way that would actually mean services are delivered on the ground in those areas. And when we start to ask the question about, well, what would it take? What would good look like if we had a really strong network of user-led organizations available in every community or service area across the country? There's sort of this question around, how do we ensure their future viability in terms of keeping the doors open, the lights on, and not having to worry about chasing the next grant? But importantly, how do we ensure that there's really good, strong support network or support framework to ensure that practice and good practice is encouraged, resourced, and supported? And so it really starts to conjure up this picture of what do we see user-led organizations potentially delivering. And I hope it's not a surprise to you, given this is about peer connect and peer support groups, but we really know that there's a invaluable role that peers play in working with people with disability. And so the future of ILC, we're hoping we'll see a real focus on user-led organizations in facilitating and hosting peer support groups and models of self-advocacy. Now, this isn't to say that that's exclusively what we would see them delivering, but absolutely seeing this notion of individual capacity building programs being delivered through peer support and self-advocacy. There's also a very important role for information and how people get information through their peers about what informal supports might be available, how to connect in with the things that are available and should be available to everybody in a local community. And so in order to make this change, which is essentially moving from an open competitive grants round where any organization of a particular entity type could apply for funding, we're wanting to move and sort of swing the pendulum a little bit more towards how can we work with and alongside the sector of user-led organizations to be able to build that capability and to be much more in the ILC space for delivering in those particular ways. Now, in order to make that move, we've needed to do some work to build the case for change. And it probably also isn't a big surprise to people to know that the evidence base is a bit thin and in fact a little bit patchy, which doesn't do us any favors when it comes to building the case for change to say, well, if we're moving from this sort of open investment model to something that's a lot more targeted and programmatic in nature, how do we know that that's the right move to make? And so back in June last year, the agency commissioned the Australia-New Zealand School of Government to work alongside the University of New South Wales through the Social Policy Research Centre to look at a practice. So we charged them with doing two things. One of them was around what practice do we know already exists domestically? We had funded things like the Disability Support Organisation Project, and there are 3 organizations in WA funded as DSOs. But we'd also invested in some other peer support type activity through Carers Australia and a number of other initiatives. And we said, help us to understand the benefits of peer support so that we can make a more informed decision about future investment. And secondly, what does the international literature tell us about the benefits of peer support? What do effective models look like? How can we actually start to build our own understanding about the value of peer support? We've now received both the draft literature review and the practice review, and the next stage of that work is to actually distill that into a useful way of informing the resources that could be developed to help support what good practice could look like in that sector. Now, I'm a little bit uncomfortable saying that it's going to be the agency dictating what peer support should look like, because obviously that's not a position that we necessarily want to take. What we have found, though, is that peer support takes looks all sorts of different ways, and that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. But one of the things that we do know is that we kind of have to strike the balance between 6 people coming together for a cuppa, the same 6 people over a 15, 20-year period, versus something that maybe takes on a little bit more of an intentional conversation. And I'm not quite sure what that sweet spot is yet, just to be perfectly honest with you, because it's different for everybody, and people are going to come for peer support for different reasons and to meet different needs. But one of the things that we do know is that there are a number of common characteristics that peer support could take. And where we have seen in areas like, in particular in the UK, where conversations around things like knowing that self-management is even an option before you even come into a planning conversation. End of the day? Oh, there we are. That the rates of self-management have increased really, really rapidly. And part of that's about understanding that it's even an option, as I said, before you even get to the planning conversation. Developing an appreciation for aspirations and thinking about life a little bit differently. thinking in a pre-planning sort of way. What are the things that would be beneficial for individuals prior to getting to that planning conversation? And in fact, how can I use my informal support networks to really broaden my connections into community, to connect in with mainstream services, all the things that I'm sure I'm telling you how to suck eggs, because that's what organizations that are probably represented in the room today largely do. So I hope I'm starting to paint a bit of a picture of what the future of ILC, these future directions might look like, because I do think there's a really valued and important role for user-led organizations going forward, that we know that models of peer support and self-advocacy are not only a good way to build people's confidence and understanding about what's possible, but importantly, going back to the core principles of an insurance scheme and thinking about, if I can self-advocate and speak up for myself and demand more, demand better, that using that platform to build my own voice, to exercise choice and control, I'm working towards realizing some of the core values of what the NDIS is really all about. So I don't know how I'm going with time. Is the fun police? Am I getting close? Did anyone have any questions? Would that be useful?
This seems like quite a major change in direction for ILC and what it will fund, because what you're describing now sounds like you took out grant applications from the first round of national readiness grants and looked at those type of projects, because in the first round we applied for gathering evidence about the effectiveness of peer support networks, trying to fill that gap about demonstrating they are effective, they are a good investment, they offer great returns to government. So what you're describing, is that a massive change in everyone's thinking in the NDIA related to the ILC funding, or has it happened over the number of years, or is it just a very recent thing?
Look, I think I could draw parallels with what you're suggesting to what we've written in the commissioning framework. But to be perfectly honest with you, this is a change. And it is a move from recognizing that the open competitive grants rounds haven't necessarily realized what we had anticipated, and that the organizations that have been successful, and admittedly some user-led organizations have been successful, but many haven't been. And so we need to look at this a little bit differently and say, well, there's got to be another way of commissioning that may not mean that open competitive grants is always the answer. In fact, there could be a mix of different commissioning approaches that we might need to look at, particularly where some of the things that I described, like core information services, might need to take a procurement or a tendering kind of approach. We've recently run a grant round specifically targeting remote communities in certain jurisdictions, and that took an entirely different approach to how we've been able to identify organizations and work with our colleagues in state and territory governments to invite particular organizations to apply. So there could be a whole range of different ways that we do it. As to the point about whether we pinched your idea, thanks for that. But you know, in seriousness, we have been doing a lot of thinking about this for some time now, and how we pick up on that core, that feedback that we had from the original consultation rounds, particularly around delivery by and for people with a disability, brings us right back to that. That's right, Sam. Yeah, people have been saying that to us, and that is something that we've tried to uphold through these grant rounds, but recognizing that the outcomes haven't been spot on. They've been okay, but I think there's some other things that we can do to ensure that this ILC program is delivered in a more consistent way, and that just because you live in Broome doesn't mean you should have a different experience of ILC than what you might in Sydney. And so a set of programs available in every service area is sort of the direction that we're wanting to move in with ILC.
Not actually a question, but just to agree with you that it's really, really vital that the people who are the ones who are being impacted are the ones who, I think you used the words user-led organisation, but, you know, people with disability are the ones that, you know, should be having the opportunities to actively participate in the outcomes.
Couldn't agree more. Yep. Thank you.
So can I make a comment?
Sure.
So for me, this is music to my ears, okay? Because for years, we have been talking about user-led organisations leading the way in the information linkage and capacity building space. We've talked about supporting family leadership, we've supporting disabled people to be able to run their own organisations, call their own shots. So for us, but the challenge has been the investment that's required to put all our bloody time into developing grants. And we're not that good at it because we're too busy doing stuff on the ground. So for me, this is music from onto my ears because there's an opportunity to look at things differently. And for me, this is the best part of the conference, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Having said that was the best bit of the conference, how many of you thought that Sam Payer was the best bit of the conference? So Sam, can I just say a little thank you to you for coming over to join us here at our Peer Connect conference. I think you've really given people food for thought. There'll be more than that. There'll be wine later, but thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, we're on to the final run now. So Bronia and I just wanted to make some final comments before we close off for the day. A little bit of a sort of wrap up and some of the key points, and potentially also about, as two people that run organisations that support peer support, what we hope might come into the future as well just from today. So I did just want to pick a couple of highlights of the day though that I wanted to just share. Agree that, you know, Sam Payer was fantastic, and I'm not going to try and summarise anything of what she said, but we have been able to video the content today for people who weren't able to attend. We will get that captioned, and we have got permission to then share that through our Facebook groups so that you can share that with your other peer support groups as well. But I actually really loved the panel. The panel today was fantastic, and it just shows that we have some really great peer leaders and peer groups that are doing a fantastic job already here in WA. And that very last section of the panel, I did take note, and I'm paraphrasing, so apologies if I don't get it completely right. I think, did everybody get the quote about peer support being nutritious? Thank you, Anna Richards. That was lovely. And I think we'll all be using that into the future. But the panel also talked about what was good and what we can learn from peer support. And there was the comment that peer support can help share the load. It can help us help each other to stop from getting burnt out. That peer support groups are a brains trust. You know, there's a hell of a lot of ideas and experiences in peer support groups. That there's power in looking at issues as a group and feeling supported in that group. That peers help give confidence to actually get out in the world so that you're not just always in a peer support group. And that again was thank you to Anna. But also that being in a peer support group, you can gain the confidence to actually take the lead and try something new. That peer support groups provide learning from each other as well as with each other. And I really loved Savannah from the Youth Disability Advocacy Network when she said that she loved that she could see and hear that everyone was different and everyone had different challenges, but they still felt that they were actually all fighting for the same thing, which was their access and inclusion and having a good life. So I thought that was just worth repeating, those pieces of wisdom from our peer leaders. It was also fantastic to hear that from the Department of Communities, from the state, that they do have a commitment to wanting to stay involved with disability. What that looks like yet, they don't know, but they want to engage with people with disabilities and carers and families as to how that continuing involvement in ensuring people with disabilities are full citizens happens at the state level. So there's a real opportunity there for us as peer support groups and as user-led organisations to make sure that we can actually provide some of that conduit for that engagement to happen with the people on the ground in the local areas. Question?
Just a statement, Sam, if I may. For me, the panel was a really powerful way of looking at the best of peer support groups. And the NDIS is like a maze. The way that it works out, you've got different stops in different places. But from today, if you go back into that maze next week, that information on that stop will have changed. What I think would be wonderful is if we could have on peer support networks stories of how the NDIS works, and when it doesn't work, what did you do to make a change? What did you do to get that planner to listen to you? So I thought the panel, I mean, Sam was amazing, but South Australia that advanced from us in the NDIS. But I think the panel held key secrets for WA, because WA is different.
Absolutely, thank you for that.
Okay.
And I think that Bronia will actually be able to answer a bit of that, but also that can come back into the feedback for later. No, thank you. So I think that's really important about one of the things peer support groups can provide in WA specific, but also that we know that regardless of what happens with the NDIA, we still need to have accessible communities and inclusive communities as well. And that's going to be the state government role. And so we still have a big role to play in making sure the state government do their job correctly and that we're actually feeding into that too. So I was really pleased to hear that from Helen, and certainly our role as a disability advocacy organisation will be to keep pushing to make sure that does happen. And then of course we heard from Steve there at the end, and as you are probably all aware, I know that many of the people here were at the initial consultation on the ILC framework, and I was lucky enough to be on a then future group looking at the commissioning framework. And it's always been that struggle of, we know that it needs to be user-led organisations doing this work, but then that doesn't always fit in with a competitive tender procurement framework government system stuff. And so it's really good to see that they're going, okay, maybe we need to do it differently, which is great. So I'm going to now hand over to Bronia, who's going to talk a little bit about what resources we currently already have, but also how we see some of the stuff we can do together into the future.
Thanks, Sam. So with the Peer Connect Disability Sector Organisation project, the DSO project that I spoke to earlier, that project actually ceases on the 30th of June. Okay, so the projects that have been undertaken to date at this stage will cease to have formal funding. But we are of the opinion and excited to be thinking about the work that has been done here in WA is just very much in its infancy stages, but we've been taking a lead role in it. So for example, the Peer Connect WA conference here today, this was just an idea of some disability DSO organisations coming together with an idea, with somebody who is pretty much saying, well, how do we make this happen, and facilitating the process. And look what we came up with today. An exciting event, no hosted arrangement, great people, all in the same room. And, like I said, when we had the idea, we thought maybe we'd attract 40 people, and we closed registrations at 180. And we did it without much money, really. Well, we actually did have to have a lot more because people needed feeding, and we got a bit stuck there for a while about how we were going to feed you all. And we were wondering if we'd have to share wraps, but that didn't happen. I'm pleased to hear, because everyone dug deep. We said, no, we need to make this happen. So it really is, for me, it was around family leadership and peer leadership here in WA. It's always been strong. We have been the leaders. We need to take the next level up and be leaders in the national scheme too. Now, we might be a little bit behind in our learnings around the national scheme, because it's been pretty limited to date for us in certain regions. But I think, we've had an opportunity here for people to learn from what's happening, and I think we've got an opportunity to lead our peers into the future. And it's my hope that Peer Connect, the national Peer Connect initiative, will come local. And we'll have Peer Connect WA. So we're really hoping that we'll have an opportunity to lead the groups, be supportive of the groups, support what needs to happen in the future, and lead this baby from the front here in Western Australia. So there'll be lots of opportunities after this conference, when we all have a chance to catch our breath, to come back to you and do some of that co-design work about what it is that you want to hear. And I love the idea about sitting down with some people who've been through the scheme to hear about what it is what's worked well with them, some of the things that we need to consider, some of the things that we need to learn, and as peer support networks, what we need to do for our own learning to be able to transform this. Because I'm a bit like Steve, it's all right to have a cup of tea. That's nice for a while, but we need to get something at the end of it. People need to come with something and get something out of it. Otherwise, they'll stop coming. And so they should. They can have a cup of tea at the Dome. I'm sure it's much better than the local community centre. So there's got to be a meaningful purpose for developing peer support networks. We use a framework. We use a strengths-based framework. This has got us through to date. We hope to be able to build upon that and bring in more people into the future. So I guess probably it's just a matter of seeing what eventuates. I'm really pleased to hear that ILC might take a bit of a different look. And I think today we have paved the way for the future. So I want to thank you all for coming. Are you saying thank you to the people who are going to be... We need to thank you. I need to thank, personally, I think one of the things that people we really need to thank here is Samantha Connor and Samantha Jenkinson for taking a lead role in this. Sam Connor had the idea to put the money down for the venue, and then we were sort of pretty much stuck with it. So, and we've been working on it ever since. Thanks, Sam. See? And Sam Jenkinson, when we were sort of looking at, how are we going to fund this, PWD-WA just said, yep, look, we've got to make this work, we'll make it happen, and they've gone out all stops to make that happen. Our other partners in this are DDWA, Beth Marchbank, take a bow. Thank you, DDWA, awesome. And Julie Island, where are you? Miss Logistics over there. Julie Island from Down Syndrome WA has been absolutely awesome on this journey. And I think that's about it.
And Bronia, Holyoake from Valued Lives. And just lastly, there are quite a number of peer leaders who've volunteered helping today. I know Andrew and Kyle, people like Shelley, people like Susan Stanford, Liz Dutton, our panellist, Davina, who did masses of work at the registration desk, who are all here unpaid just because they believe in the power of us coming together. So please, a big thank you to all the peer support volunteers. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the day. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone.